Okay, my background is, I was an American Studies major in college, decided I wanted to know something more than just opinion. So without any medical or scientific background to speak of, I went to medical school. So went to medical school, and I said, ooh. Then one day I discovered neurology. I said, this is for me. So I went through neurology training. Then one day I said, I think I'd like to write novels. So I published a few novels. And then I wrote a book that turned out badly. I wrote what I thought was a novel, but my agent, with an expression of thumb to the nose, said this is not a novel, and I realized it was a nonfiction book. And that was the first nonfiction book I wrote, called On Being Certain. And that led to the second book, A Skeptic's Guide to the Mind. Meanwhile, I practiced neurology until a few years ago and ran the neurology department in one of the San Francisco hospitals. And now I just write full time. And look out the window and say, I don't know. Yes and no. They're identical and dissimilar. In other words, those of us who were trained in neurology in the olden days, it was preceding CAT scans and MRIs. They just came into vogue just at the end of our training period. And so most of us were trained in clinical neurology, Oliver Sacks and so on. So if you think of Oliver Sacks, he was the last of the old generation of British trained neurologists who basically were bedside phenomenologists. You looked at patients and judging by their behavior, you made decisions as to their medical problems. But it also was something in which you speculated on what the mind is. Meanwhile, there was a separate path of neuroscientists, which were primarily PhDs who were really gifted in basic science. And they marched up this chain to, with basic science, whereas neurology came to the phenomenology, and as time has come, they sort of merged together, and so that you really have to know both in order to do either. But they were separate. They're now quite similar, although neurologists tend to think of themselves as more clinically oriented, and neuroscientists tend to be more bench scientists, but it's getting to be more and more of an artificial distinction. In my first book, what I was struck by was the difference between the way we know something and how we feel about what we know. And a good example was the very first thing that sort of started me thinking about this was they did a study on the Challenger study. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but basically they took 120 plus kids who were in college, and it was the morning the Challenger shuttle blew up. They took them 2.5 hours later, and then they said, write a journal, describe exactly what you saw in vivid detail. So the people all wrote what they did at that very moment in vivid detail. And then the guy called them back 2.5 years later, and lo and behold, 25% got it even approximately correct, and only 10% got it completely correct. Well, we sort of understand that memory changes over time, so it wasn't particularly surprising. But what struck me was that one student wrote, in the article, he said, that's my handwriting, referring to his journal, but that's not what happened. And I thought, well, he's got to know that what he wrote 2.5 hours after the accident is more likely than something 2.5 years after the accident to be correct. So he cognitively knows A, but he feels B. So I thought, well, what's happened in the interval? And so that led me to think about how the brain works. And so this has led to me, for my work over the last 10 or 15 years, which maybe I explained in a few sentences, is I thought, well, what is it? And we see all these conditions in neurology where people have a sense of something cognitively dissonant from what they feel. So they feel something. A good example is somebody dies. Now you know they're dead, but you still feel they're alive. I mean, you wake up in the middle of the night and you feel like you're going to phone them. Now you know that that's ridiculous, but you can't get the feeling out of your mind that they're alive. So that's a pretty simple example, but there are loads of them and it occurred to me that there's something called involuntary mental sensations, and I don't like the word, but it's maybe the best one I can come up with. Namely, your brain makes some sort of unconscious calculation, then it sends up into your consciousness some feeling tone about it. So for example, if I've never met you before, I don't know who you are. So I see your face, no pattern recognition. Now the next time I see you, I'll say, well, that's an 80% chance it's you. Or maybe 40% chance, depending on what you're wearing and your hair color, this, that, and follow me. And so at some critical point, you'll have not only pattern recognition, which is what the unconscious brain does, but you'll have a feeling that emanates out of involuntary mechanisms that tells you the value of the computation. It tells you the likelihood. So when you recognize somebody, although you feel like, oh, let me see, oh yeah, no, that's done unconsciously, and then this feeling arises. So it occurred to me, there are a lot of states like that, and they include familiarity, sense of agency, how we determine causation, how we even think about our body. Well, once you start adding them all together, you get to a peculiar point where you say, what do we experience as a mind? Okay, we have a very small amount of short-term memory. We can remember a phone number. We can remember 4 or 5 chunks of information. That's it. It's all we can carry on consciously. The rest of it's done unconsciously, then brought back up into consciousness along with feeling tones generated in the unconscious. But what it's led me to think about is, the obvious question is, what is a person? What is a self? What is a mind? And I thought, well, who's studying this? And it's the mind made primarily out of a very small amount of short-term memory that only lasts for a minute or two, that small amount of information, emotions, and these involuntary sensations, they collectively are your experience of a self. And we now know from neuroscience studies on sense of self can be changed. If you stimulate areas of the brain, you get an out-of-body experience, for example. You can, if you take a monkey and you put an electrode in an area of his brain, so it says, my hand is right here, so you see the cells will fire whenever the monkey's his hand approaches a peanut, let's say. Now you give the monkey a rake, and the rake's out here. And now you'll find after a week or so that the cells for the sort of body representation of the monkey fire when the peanut's at the edge of the rake. Now you think about that in terms of our smartphones, PDAs, and all the rest of it, and you go, well, where does our self end and where does the external world arise? But the curious thing is we do have a body image of ourself, which gives us a sense of a unique embodied condition, we'll call it, for lack of a better word. In other words, you exist in proportion to the neural maps, neural networks that you have. That will be altered by your environment. So a rake will do it, PDA will do it. If you follow me, if you hold a baseball bat, after a while the end of the baseball bat will be part of your body schema. Okay. And there was an interesting study I read, which kind of got me thinking. It's a woman who had a small stroke that left her without a sense of her left arm and leg as being hers. So it took away her sense of ownership of this side of her body. But her wedding ring had been on there for so long that it had been incorporated into the body schema, so that when she looked at the wedding ring on her left hand, she did not recognize it. But if you took the ring out for her left hand and put it in her right hand, which was unaffected, she said, that's my wedding ring. So what it told you is that she lost the sense of ownership of it in this place, left hand, present in the right hand. Now, if you think about that, then you say, okay, we have an ownership of body parts. We have a sense of a unique self embodied in your representational map of how far you are if you think about the monkey. And then you think, well, what is the mind? And we have a sense of ownership of a mind in the same way we have a sense of ownership of our body parts. And we have a sense of our thoughts being ours. So we have a sense of agency, causation, all of these are involuntary sensations. They are brain generated. They give us our perspective on the world. So you say, what do I think is missing in neuroscience? Well, the study of neuroscience is done by people who, including myself, who are thinking about the mind and the brain and judging the accuracy of their decisions by involuntary sensations over which they have no control. So here this weekend you have all these various people talking, including me, So I'm not excluding myself from this, who have these notions. That's my idea. I have a unique mind that's embodied in a person that has unique thoughts. And not only that, because I have a very strong sense of agency, which we can go into more times, we'll go into some detail in my book. We have a sense of agency which says if I have thoughts that are mine and they have agency, thoughts create other thoughts. And therefore we believe in our lines of reasoning as being our lines of reasoning. How much of this is true, which is what you were asking, versus how much of this is illusions, and I don't use the words as a pejorative illusions, but sensations that are beyond our control that look like they're within our control. And once you think of the mind in that way, you realize, okay, the mind is a small amount of working memory for a short period of time. It's your emotions and these feelings that color all of your decision making. That's what we're using to study the mind. And that's what we're using to create our philosophies. And on the other hand, you can start to think in terms of how it might affect the way we think. For example, if you feel personally embodied, but a distance between you and other people, now you have a sense of alienation. You have a sense of existentialism, if you follow me. So I think that a lot of the future of thinking about the relationship with the brain and the mind will be in how these sensations really affect and are part and parcel of our sort of lines of reasoning. So you're asking the $64 question. And you know, it's interesting. I will just, as a digression, because that's all I am, is a series of digressions, because there is no central point, is I did this like 2-hour interview on NPR. And this guy said, I'm going to ask you for the 10 millionth time the question you just asked me. He said, what is it that perceives the sense of I? And my response was, ask me another question. And if you think about it, this is why I gave you the preamble. Now let's supposing I'm trying to answer your question. Who is it that's going to be answering the question? How am I going to go about it? And one of the problems is that the mechanisms that I bring to answering that question are going to be based upon how I think about the world. For example, as a neurologist, a lot of people say, oh, the brain is the mind. Okay? Everything has to be there in the brain. Now, I don't doubt that, but one of the reasons I don't doubt that is because that's the way I've been trained. I have no idea if that's true above and beyond. That's the way I have been taught to think. You follow me? So if I took that away and hadn't been taught to think that, and you asked me that same question, I'd go, I don't know how to think about this. So one of the problems, the question you asked me is, how do you think about this? That is stripped of culture, that is stripped of history. And the answer is, I haven't got a clue. So we each try in our own feeble way to come up with an answer in the hopes that it will sound halfway reasonable without any real knowledge if it's correct. So I know you asked me this question with hopes I'll give you an answer, but that's why I told you I'm a master of the I don't know. So let me try to answer this in a convoluted way, like everything I answer. If science is a consensus opinion on how to think about things, that's relatively brief in duration. I mean, 300 years for modern science, maybe, give or take. And we have developed scientific method, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the best way of understanding the physical world. I mean, there is no other way that I'm aware of as far as methodology. Now, it is true that we ask questions from the same cognitive stew over which we have relatively little control. A good example is, what's good nutrition? Now, we ask that question like we can figure out an answer. But the fact of the matter is it's so incredibly complex that it's hard to come up with a single answer for something as simple as nutrition. Seemingly simple as nutrition. But we can do empirical studies from our point of view saying, okay, if you pick a particular endpoint, heart disease, cancer, mortality, that might give you the best nutrition. But if you chose a different set of measurements, happiness, joy, whatever, you might get a different set of measurements. So science is a lens through which you look for things, and so you try to find endpoints that satisfy a specific question. If they can satisfy a specific question like, does cigarette smoking cause lung cancer? Then it can work for that specific question. So it is quasi-objective. It is objective within our culture. Now, someone may come along in another millennium and show that a lot of the scientific method we have is fallacious. I mean, you see all the time about arguments on statistics, and you see even the best half of the studies that are presented nowadays are not reproducible and so on. So, is it an objective lens? It is objective in the sense that we call things objective. In other words, we label science as objective, and therefore in that sense it's objective. Is it objective in some larger picture? That's right. I mean, a lot of the science that we do now, I think, will fall in disrepute, particularly in terms of statistical analysis of certain things in which one time it's positive, one time it's negative, and you make some sort of decision. Other kinds of things are pretty objective, like if you measure the speed of light, I mean, it's pretty good and objective within the frame of reference of measurements. So it is the best objectivity we can do, but it is still starting from the framework of minds within the heads of scientists or wherever minds exist. And so it's objective with those limitations. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it depends on the decision. If the decision can be reduced to something that's measurable, like if you say to me, if my cholesterol's high, should I continue taking, should I take medication, should I lower it, what should I do? I don't have trouble because I have empirical evidence, within the understanding that there's variability in science, I have empirical evidence upon which to make a decision. I can make a decision. I mean, neurology is basically about decision making. You decide what's best, someone's best interest, but you have to figure out what variables you're going to weigh into it. Now, if it's quality of life, it's whether or not you believe in lingering death versus risky procedure. You follow me? You make decisions. I don't have trouble with those kinds of decisions. I have enormous difficulty with decisions for which there's no objective answer. For example, what do you do in Syria? There isn't any answer for that. They're just personal preferences. You can think it out as best you can, but someone else might present an alternative that's equally valid. So no, I don't have trouble with decisions, but so in my own personal life, I know when something, I try to divide things into the decidable and the undecidable. If it's undecidable, then I'll weigh which one seemed the most likely, but I will be willing to listen to people who may have an alternative frame of reference that is different than what I think. I may disagree with them, but if it's something where I know it's possible that there's room for alternatives, I'm willing to entertain them. So I think it really is, for me, it's a matter of deciding. The decision for me is this empirical evidence for which there's clear-cut evidence, for which case then that's that kind of decision. The other is one in which you weight the decision, but inform the other person that this is something that is open to question. There are different kinds of decisions. I used to write, as I mentioned, I wrote novels, and at that time I sort of thought there's a best line of reasoning, and every other line of reasoning is inferior if you come up with the right argument. But since I've written this book, I realized that the way your brain works, there is no single correct line of reasoning, because each stems from a particular viewpoint, from genetics to culture and all the rest, that make it that this guy's line of reasoning, this guy's line of reasoning, and mine may be incompatible, but without one being definitely better. That's why I'm saying if you can prove it, so you can do some wide-ranging study, but 99% of decisions in modern life aren't empirically based. I mean, you know, with politics, whatever. So for me, no, I think what's helped me is to think, I no longer trust any particular line of reasoning, including my own, as being the best one. And I would just tell you personal experience for what it's worth is that I remember when my mom died, she was a devout atheist. I mean, she said, I don't want any service, I don't want any memorial, just throw me in the ocean. Okay. So I said, well, I'll take a little walk and I'll go down and to the Marin Headlands, say goodbye. But on the way down, I happened to see this little flower, and this flower had a pattern on it that I'd never seen before. It was just a circular, spirally purple pattern on a white background. And I thought, well, that's a great flower. Well, I had just been reading this book by this mathematician, Stephen Wolfram, and it's on cellular automata, about how computer modeling can generate these marvelous, intricate patterns in nature. And I said, could be made by cellular automata. This thing with absolutely no meaning, no purpose, no higher anything. I said, on the other hand, I suppose, even though I don't believe in this kind of stuff, I mean, at a conscious level, this could be a message from my mother. And I said, okay, science says this. And I said, I don't have to decide. So I walked down the road and I said, could be either one. It doesn't really make any difference. This one's irrational. People will laugh at me. I don't care. And this one, well, maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. Because I found both of them as compatible, even though they were completely contradictory. So for me, understanding that the thing that was making the decision as to which of these is right is itself not my choice, I'll accept them both. So you follow me? Partially. I think it's a limitation if you don't accept that it's paradoxical. For example, this is why I mentioned to you about these involuntary mental sensations, is if you think that it's your mind which is creating hypotheses that you then set out to prove. And if the hypothesis is about a mind and the mind generated the hypothesis about it, you've got to understand that's like an Escher drawing. It is a circular paradox. Okay, you can go ahead and do that. Much better if you know that this is paradoxical. You say, I think this is an interesting idea. I'm going to pursue this, but I'm not going to be wedded to it in the sense that it has to prove my point because I understand that there's some basic limitations in what you do. So no, I think science's limitations are really in the realm of extrapolating from basic science to things about the real world. In other words, cellular mechanisms for which you win a Nobel Prize like last week. That's great science at the level of synapses, cells. It still doesn't explain how the mind works. Now, when you try to extrapolate that to who we are, and this, then you're at another level of explanation. If you understand that this level of explanation is not solved by empirical evidence at this level, you're better off. Then you can make all kinds of postulates. I mean, that's what neurologists, we've always done, is we stand around the bedside and we speculate. But you label it as speculation. You say, here's the science as best we understand it, and here we're going to another level, which is speculation. So the limitation of science to me is really in recognizing when you're telling facts as we understand facts, versus when you're telling a story or extrapolating from the story to create it, extrapolating from the facts to create a story. And if we understood that, we'd get further, or at least we would allow for more alternatives. Well, I did neurology for many years, so I did them both actually at the same time. And yes, I used, all my novels were basically what ifs. What if you were a doctor and you lost your license? What if you woke up and you had 10 identical brothers, like in cloning? And there's what it would be if your sense of self is in some way distorted. So they were hypotheticals, not based on hard science, but using the best available science around. What I really have come to understand is that all scientists are telling stories about the facts that they've gathered. In other words, if you tell me that cells in your brain our so-called mirror neurons create the feeling of empathy, okay, you can show that cells are firing. But when you say that these are creating empathy, you're now extrapolating from this information to tell a story about what you believe empathy is and how you think it arises. That's fine if that's your story, but you know, if you go to a writers' conference, people telling all kinds of stories, some of which you hate, some of which you love. If you understood that that's this level science and this level storytelling, we're all picking and choosing. I mean, I don't know much about meditations in terms of the scientific back. I mean, I've read some stuff, but I don't know enough to be able to make a coherent comment. But if you think about it this way, you meditate. Like Jim Austin was talking today about seeing certain lights and so on. So he had a sensory phenomena that occurred during his meditation that has meaning for him. You know, you watch people that have, I'm digressing to answer your question, you watch people that build boats in a bottle or something, and you go, why would you do that? What possible purpose is there in building a boat in a bottle? You ask the guy who's doing it, and he goes, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. I love doing this. And while he's doing it, he has a great sense of purpose. Okay, so purpose itself is a feeling tone that you have. When you have it, you have it. You feel really good about life, and when you don't have it, it's really hard to find. When people are depressed, you can't just go to them and say, you need a sense of purpose, and they suddenly go, I'll buy one at the grocery store. It doesn't work like that. Okay, so now imagine, to go back to this, where you are meditating, and you feel really good. You now also feel really good, like this has purpose. I'm not saying it does or doesn't, but it feels like it has purpose. So now it is a different state of mind. It's a state of mind in which you experience involuntary sensations, whatever they might be, and then you tack onto it the semantic argument. There's purpose to this. This is giving me cosmic understanding. This is giving me a sense of touch of oneness. What you're really doing is you're giving a label to the experience, which you didn't create. I mean, you may have facilitated it by meditating. Well, if you think about it, everything you do is going to show up on an fMRI scan one way or another, because where else is it going to happen? I mean, you're not going to have a visual image that's occurring in your chair. I mean, it's going to be occurring inside your brain. So it's only natural. But if you think about it, all of these neural networks take time to develop. If you learn to walk, first you can't walk, and then you crawl, and then you stand, and then you stumble around, and then you walk, okay? I mean, but you learn over a period of time. Now you have a neural network for walking. Now if I ask you to imagine walking, you're going to activate that network. So if I ask you to imagine it, you're going to see this light up on your fMRI. It doesn't tell you anything you wouldn't know from common sense. That you've got to have something in your, some set of connections in your brain that allows you to walk. I mean, that is not particularly startling. And so when they say that certain areas of your brain light up with meditation, well, of course. I mean, it's meaningless at that level. But it may be helpful in the sense that you see certain areas over other areas, but even that is really an update of phrenology in many ways. Well, there was a really interesting article with a set of rebuttals that came out, I don't know, within the last 3 months, let's say, in something called the Boston Interview. What was important about it is a lady who's a legal scholar from Stanford wrote about the fact that we don't have free will, that we are involuntary selves that do these various activities. Therefore, you shouldn't blame criminals for their behavior. And then there are all these arguments from various philosophers and various academic institutions and psychologists, and all of them weighing in on the subject. And one guy argues, well, if you can't blame somebody, then you can't feel a sense of pride in doing something decent, because by the same token, if it's all involuntary, then you can't feel accolades, pride, joy, ambition, etc. And what we're really at is at sort of the interface between the old way of thinking about human beings and a new way. Really the question is, if something is a construct that in its absence leads to chaos, you now have to decide how you have laws. I mean, I actually thought about writing a little story about a robotic jury. Because what do you want? Do you want a real jury with all of their qualms, or do you want a robot who's going to stick with the letter of the law? And when you think, as soon as you think about it, you go, well, this is not really an obvious answer. You ask people, everybody answers it differently, because so we're really at a point now where it's hard to fully accept the involuntary construct nature of a self and still have a society. On the other hand, when you have this sense of self being so strong, a sense of uniqueness, you end up with the kind of partisan politics you see now, and you see this kind of know-it-allism and arrogance, and it makes me so I don't even have a TV anymore. I can't stand it. So the question is, how do you resolve this? So and if it does become part of mainstream, it will have to have a new construct of how to live together. I don't have the imagination to figure that out, though I'm going to think about it. Oh yeah, and you can, if you smell fresh bread cooking, you're more generous, or I mean, and see, really the issue, which I have not even, I don't even know how to pose it properly in my mind, is if what I've just said is true, even partially true, how do you go forward? I mean, how do you go forward? And how would you instruct people who have a very strong sense of their self-identity? I mean, what do you say to them? I don't know what the answer is. Well, you know, I was at where I work out, some guy came in the locker room and he was talking about the internet, and he said to me what I thought was just a fabulous quote, and he didn't mean it to be funny. He said, you know, there's so much information out there, I have trouble keeping up with reality. I thought it was like fabulous. I don't think he knew what he said, but it's like, you know, so the more questions you ask me, the more answers I give you, you go, well, does that get us any closer? No. It's just fun.